Hello. In this episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, I was extremely privileged to get to speak with John Boughton, social historian and writer, and, for those of you who don't know, blogger at the hugely insightful and important Municipal Dreams, a job that he's been doing, it seems, for free since 2013. Municipal Dreams explores the history, impact and legacy of social and council housing in Britain, highlighting its architectural, political and social significance. In 2018, John turned this into a major book, Municipal Dreams, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing, which was published by Verso, followed in 2022 by A History of Council Housing in 100 Estates, published with Reba Publishing.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to John Boughton, better known, perhaps, by his podcast name Municipal Dreams. John, before we get into discussing that and the wonderful book that you wrote, Municipal Dreams, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing, which you published with Verso in 2018, I wonder if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself slightly more fully.
Yes, certainly. Thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm pleased to be here, as it were. I've written two books on council housing. The one that you mentioned, Municipal Dreams, Rise and Fall of Council Housing, published in 2018, and History of Council Housing 100 Estates, published by Reba Publishing in 2023. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, I've written a blog since about 2012. Which is essentially, it's covered a range of local government reform, but has concentrated very heavily again on council housing, and that's certainly that's had a pretty amazing reach, if I say so immodestly, probably something like 2.5 million views. So I'm really, firstly, I'm really pleased to have had that sort of impact and be able to tell this story, which I think is a very important one.
I was looking at your podcast and first post, January the 1st, 2013. What caused this? Was this a long-standing interest? Because you're not an architect. You're described by your publishers and described online as a social historian.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm certainly not an architect. I'm not an architectural historian, but I'm very grateful for those people who are. And I've hoped that I've been able to use some of that expertise and knowledge in my own writing. But I'm a social historian. So I did a history degree, and I did a PhD in social history a long time ago, back in the 1980s. So that's my kind of professional interest, if you will, as a historian. But I've also been, was, and I still am to some extent, pretty political in my personal life. I was, for a while, a Labour councillor. So really writing the blog, beginning the blog in 2013, was an opportunity to combine two things that were very important to me, both the sort of a significant part of working class history. 1 in 3 British households lived in council housing. 1 in 3 people in England and Wales lived in council housing in the early 1980s, over 50% in Scotland. So I wanted to tell that story, which I think has been sort of marginalised and maligned over the years. I wanted, in a sense, to give that history back to the people who had lived it, to honour it more respectfully than it has sometimes been covered. And of course, I was fulfilling my own politics, in a sense, telling that story, telling what I think is without sort of sugarcoating. And obviously, there were missteps and mistakes along the way. But I'm telling what I think overall is a very positive story, and one with lessons both from the past and in the present.
Yeah, I think you do that. Where did you do your PhD? What's your background? I mean, what part of London are you from? Are you from London? And this PhD, I'm kind of interested in hearing about this as well.
Well, so I'm not from London. I live in London currently, but I was brought up in Norfolk, in fact.
Which part?
Sheringham, North Norfolk coast.
Such a beautiful beach.
Yeah, lovely place to grow up. Nice, good place to leave aged 18. So I left at 18. haven't been back since. Although I've visited, but I haven't. But so I went to the University of Manchester to do my first degree in history, and I did my PhD at the Centre for the Study of Social History, as it then was, at the University of Warwick. And the subject matter, the topic, was one of those kind of niche topics, but obviously a very important one as far as I was concerned: working class politics in Birmingham and Sheffield, 1918 to 1931.
Oh, I see.
Of course, interesting thing, I won't talk about that too much, but the interesting thing about that, of course, was that Birmingham was a solidly Tory council at that time, but built an enormous number of council houses. So I've always been interested in that kind of cross-class, cross-party significance and commitment to council housing.
It's very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about this council housing phenomenon? Because I think, this podcast has global reach, and as does your blog. And I suppose there's a kind of similarity here, that through this piece of work, you're introducing a specific concept of the council house or the British council house to a global population. But for people, for perhaps my generation, so I was born after council housing's zenith, I suppose, after its glory years. And for most people, I think they see it as this post-war or 20th century phenomenon, but it's a much longer history that you document.
Yes, certainly. And I guess for an international audience, one should sort of reference council housing. I mean, I guess the clue's in the name. But council housing in a British context is public housing, social housing, we call it nowadays, which was built by local authorities, funded primarily by and legislated by the central government, but built by local councils, by local authorities, as I say. And this was the absolute central element of British public housing. And Britain is pretty unusual in this compared to most continental countries, certainly, where you have a variety of kind of third sector bodies responsible for council housing. In Britain, it's always been a combination of the national and local state, or it has been, or was, I should say, until around 1980, when things changed quite radically. But it does have a long history. In a sense, one can go back to pre-industrial times, our almshouses, which of course are private patronage, but actually is a sort of neglected history of what was called parish housing and poor houses, which were designed to help those in most need. But that essentially kind of broke down in the kind of the heyday of Victorian laissez-faire, the belief that non-interference, the belief in the efficacy of the free market, which coincided, of course, with the heyday of the British Industrial Revolution. So if you imagine that the population of the UK sort of quadrupled between 1800 and 1900, goes from about 11 million to 41 million. If you imagine the kind of pace of urbanization that takes place in that time, you have this unprecedented concentration of poverty, not poverty that's new, but concentrated and visible in those new industrial towns. And in due course, this really arouses a lot of elite concern, shall we say, on a variety of grounds. That means that this slum housing is alleged to sort of give rise to criminality, immorality. Mm-hmm. It certainly promotes ill health, and there's a concern that ill health, when it's little understood, that disease will sort of cross social boundaries. And there's also, by the later 19th century, a fear that the British working class, that those that are predominantly housed in this in these slum dwellings, are becoming unfit to work, unfit to compete or fight militarily. So you have a lot of elite concern. You have equally, of course, you have compassion, philanthropy, humanitarian concern. And increasingly, of course, as the 19th century develops, as trade unionism increases, labor organization, labor socialist politics increases, you get also pressure from below.
And I guess a fear of revolution.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we can talk more specifically about that, oddly, in 1918, but certainly a desire to placate potential working class unrest. Absolutely. And of course, seen most visibly in the rise of the Labour Party from 1900 onwards, and new liberalism, which is a sort of semi-statist version of liberalism, which emerges at the turn of the new century. So certainly, yeah, there's a politics. There's a powerful politics. So you see public health legislation emerging from 1848, but essentially you see a Royal Commission on the housing of the working classes in 1884. The Prince of Wales, the member of that commission, and you see the first legislation, the first major piece of legislation in 1890, the Housing of the Working Classes Act, and all these are an attempt to address housing crisis, but particularly, and this is where the politics comes in a sense, or a version of the politics. It was clear by 1890 that the free market, that private contractors, builders, speculative builders would not build suitable housing, affordable and sanitary housing for working class people in the numbers and at the scale that was required. So the state steps in, even at the height almost of sort of laissez-faire, non-intervention. It becomes clear to the Victorian ruling class that state intervention is required.
So this state intervention is at the level of national politics, but you document in the first chapter of the book the first instance of what you identify as council housing happening in Liverpool, which is an action independent of centralised policy. So is there a body of buildings, so to speak, a portfolio of examples of instances of council housing or council-funded housing, which demonstrates the efficacy of this policy?
Well, I think the Liverpool case is actually a very interesting one, of course, and it was a Tory council, Tory democracy at the time, so it had a sort of combination of throne and empire and an elevation of the working classes, which was kind of, I don't want to get too detailed here, but kind of Disraeli and progressive conservative politics. But to bring it to basics, Liverpool City Council wanted private builders to build that first housing scheme. They offered the plans, they offered the land. No private builder was interested in taking it on. So in the end, it had to, in that sense, be built by the corporation. So that is a very kind of direct indication, I guess, of the story I was telling about the failure of the private market in this context. It was unusual. Obviously, local government can't do anything which isn't basically enabled, permitted by central government. So there was some sort of minor legislation which allowed local authorities to do that. Very few took it up before 1890. Just literally Liverpool, Huddersfield, I think. So the 1890 Act. Of course, the other thing which really happens, the crucial thing that happens, which I almost forgot to mention, is that you have a major reform of local government in 1889. 1894, 1900. So you have a modern representative form of local government created in that era. And it's the combination of the national legislation and the machinery of local government coming together in the 1890s, which really allows council housing to grow significantly, to emerge quite powerfully in that period. That said, before 1914, before the First World War, only 24,000 council homes were built nationally. 10,000 of those were in London. The London County Council was one of the most progressive and interventionist of local authorities. So certainly by 1914, there was a track record and a solid kind of demonstration of what could be achieved. But it was still pretty small scale.
You've mentioned already that there was this kind of philanthropic string to it. And I'm assuming that much of this was driven by various forms of nonconformist and mainstream Christianity, and also, as you say, this socialism that has started to permeate public consciousness. But what does the evidence suggest was the principal objective of this? I mean, I know we've touched on this before, but was there some form of moralistic correction that was at the heart of this idea, or was there a genuinely egalitarian goal? And I guess I'm asking because I think, and we'll get to this in a bit, contemporary perceptions of council housing has gone through a huge change since the 1980s. There is this idea that council housing equates in some way to various forms of, as you suggested earlier, moral deficiency. Essentially, is this in the origins of this movement, and even in this early 20th century, is this still very much there? Is it, I guess what I'm getting at, is it a form of internalized colonialism?
Well, there's a lot to unpack, isn't there, in that, and a lot of currents, competing and complementary currents. So you began by talking about sort of Christian influence in various forms, and that was certainly in terms of the kind of mobilization of public opinion. particularly in the 1880s, that was really important. You've got the Reverend Andrew Mearns, who was a nonconformist minister, writing a book, a pamphlet called The Bitter Cry of Outcast London. It was a bestseller at the time. Its first chapters deal with non-attendance at church. He goes on to talk about various elements of immoral behaviour in what were called at the time the rookeries, the worst of the most concentrated areas of slum housing. William Booth, founded the Salvation Army, wrote a book called, in the same period, wrote a book called In Darkest England, which of course is an echo of the sort of imperialist attitudes and ideology of the day in Darkest Africa, translated into a British context. So for them, of course, there was definitely an improving element. In other respects, clearly, I think you have liberal reformers who have a much more sort of progressive. That's slightly loaded language there, but would have a more progressive ideology, a more sympathetic ideology to working class lives and working class needs. Than that kind of de haut en bas kind of attitude that we referenced earlier, as well, of course, as we've referenced briefly, the Labour campaigners, the socialist campaigners, and so on. So I think there's all kinds of things, but yes, I think definitely you have what was called the quest for national efficiency, which was a kind of almost a cross-party kind of drive in the late 19th century, and that was certainly intended to promote a fitter working class, fitness defined not only by physical health, but by mental health and so on. And of course, you have these quite powerful eugenicist currents in the late 19th century, which obviously went on to have a very dark history, but this time have quite a kind of progressive cachet, and this desire to breed better, to put it simply and crudely.
Yeah.
I mean, the irony is, of course, just to sort of talk about this complexity. When you look at council housing, when you look at the first council housing built from the 1890s before the war and into the early interwar period, it's overwhelmingly council housing for the respectable working class, because the respectable working class, those in steady employment and with reasonable, relatively good wages, they were the only ones that could afford council housing. It was council housing for, as I say, a relatively affluent working class, and there was a hope that there was something at the time called the filtering up theory, and there was a hope that the poorer working class, the slummiest working class, as it were, might move into slightly better housing vacated by those who moved into council housing, but there was a quite clear understanding that council housing itself at that time couldn't cater for what some call the submerged tenth, or what we later would call an underclass.
And this all seems to me to be entirely predicated on an idea of the efficacy of architecture to achieve sort of morally improving or ethically improving ends, which is quite an interesting idea. I would be very interested, given the contemporary narrative around the need to build 1.5 million houses, a nice round number plucked out of who knows where, that no one's talking about it as a kind of instrument of social change. They're just talking about it as, if anything, an instrument of economic necessity. So there's quite an interesting thing in this period, the idea that you would move this submerged tenth up into the slightly better houses as they moved up, and I'm assuming become better citizens through this lovely architecture. Is that fair? Is that reasonable?
Well, there's certainly the hope. They not only wanted to house the working class, they wanted to improve it, and that was certainly true for, as I say, or as it happens, this was the most, inverted commas, respectable element of the working class. So it was moving into council era, but nevertheless, their behaviour was quite closely monitored. Obviously, regular payment of the rents, that was a sort of an essential. No housing benefit at the time, so they had to be able to pay their rents, and they were evicted if they didn't. But also quite close monitoring in terms of their behaviour their cleanliness and so on, housing visitors, sometimes in some of the larger sort of tenement blocks, supervisors that would kind of police behaviour. I mean, you can see this is moving away from council housing, but if you look at the early Peabody housing, George Peabody was an American philanthropist who invested in social housing, and those early Peabody estates were, very close. They had a paid supervisor to monitor behaviour, and they closed the gates at 10 o'clock, so 10 o'clock in the evening. So there was quite clearly very, very sort of elements of quite powerful social control, which of course were also resented by many people in the working class and many of those early tenants.
The period I suppose most of us connect with, or many of us connect with, council housing is the post-war period, post-Second World War period. And obviously there was a compelling need for it because of urban destruction, particularly in London. But there was another thing, which is this idea that I put to you in the notes, which I drew from my reading of your book, which is this idea that there was a need to reimagine what the nation was in the context of in the lee of the sort of the Second World War. And then there's this other thing, which is the apparent need to modernize society, modernize everything, I guess driven by the technological advancements of that first half of the 20th century. What role was council housing seen as playing in this modernization process? Was it articulated through policy? Was it a public discourse around this? Was council housing reimagined in a new way in the mid-20th century?
Yeah, well, again, it's a complex and kind of longer story. So if I may, I'll sort of go back slightly, and just to throw some numbers out. So as I say, 24,000 council homes built before 1914. Between 1919 and 1939, 1.1 million. So you can see already there's a pretty significant sea change. The 1919 Housing Act, I should say, is really crucial here, as it required local authorities to build housing where need was demonstrable, and also set quite high standards of that council housing. And when you talked earlier about the fear of revolution, well, the 1919 Housing Act, in the wake of revolutions in Russia and actually in Germany at the time, was, as well as intended to sort of reward the wartime sacrifice of workers and soldiers, was intended to prevent any fear of any threat of revolution in the 1920s, and quite explicitly so if you read the kind of political discussions at the time. So there was that, and as I said, also, sorry, just again taking it back to this sort of the longer story. As I said, ironically, for all the kind of social engineering and good intentions of the earlier phases of council housing, up to the 1930s, it really didn't touch as I say, didn't address the problems of the worst housed in the UK. And so from 1930, you get the legislation is redirected. The drive to council housing remains, but it's now directed towards slum clearance and the rehousing of slum dwellers. So you have quite a powerful and strong slum clearance drive in the 1930s. And of course, in that context, the Second World War is a huge and damaging interruption. But getting us to the Second World War, you're absolutely right. Of course, you set it up. Around 2 million homes were damaged or destroyed across the country as a result of wartime damage. And in March 1945, it's still a period of coalition government. A government white paper policy document says that the country needs 750,000 new homes. And in addition to that total, it needs 500,000 to replace existing slums. So housing is absolutely at the top of the agenda in 1945. And when the Labour government, the incoming Labour government, talks about winning the peace, the first majority Labour government, of course, part of that is absolutely building the new Britain to emerge from not only the kind of devastation of war, but what we're seeing as the wasted years and of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So there's absolutely a desire to build anew. The spirit of 45 can be romanticized and exaggerated, but it's a crucial element of obviously a range of reform in the later 1940s. You've obviously got the NHS, you've got Social Security on a much broader scale, but housing was actually definitely a vital element of that. With, as I say, absolute political priority, because there was an immediate housing crisis in 1946, to show you just how politically salient the housing crisis was. 40,000 people. These are not some sort of Trotskyist agitators. These were ordinary men and women of Britain, occupying disused army camps. They wanted the roof over their head that those disused military facilities could offer. Over 1,000 military camps occupied by this squatting movement in that period. So Labour is committed, obviously, politically, ideologically, to housing, building housing at a huge scale, and it does combine, as you say, with this sort of idealism about what that new housing, what type of community, what type of new country would be created. I think you see that in a number of elements. I mean, if you think about, for me, the idealism, you think about the idealism and the kind of aspiration, 1940s, most explicitly, it's kind of summed up in one word. It's summed up in the word planning. And the idea was that the economy could be planned, that housing should be planned, obviously healthcare and so on. But planning, this technocratic power, harnessing the machinery of state, which had been harnessed, of course, on a massive scale for war, could be harnessed for the purposes of peace. And if you look at the planning ideals specifically relating to housing, you're talking about what were called neighbourhood units. This notion that the new estates would be centred around populations of 6,000-10,000 people, featuring a church, community facilities, everything that was required. That those neighbourhood units would promote community, would promote cohesion and neighbourliness. And I think that the single most powerful kind of illustration of most idealistic kind of urges of the time were the new towns, because the new towns, this program of 8 new towns around London, 13 I think across the country, inaugurated in 1946. These combined all the kind of planning ideals that we've alluded to, but absolutely this hope of a kind of new citizenry, I think. Lewis Silkin, who was a minister of town and country planning, who introduced the legislation in 46, was very explicit about this. He referenced Thomas More. He referenced utopia. And he said, and I'll quote here, he said, "The true measure of new town success would be the kind of citizens they produce, by whether they create the spirit of friendship, neighbourliness, and comradeship."
That's a very beautiful idea. You were talking about the new towns. I hadn't written to you about new towns because I feel like it's another thing that could open out of this, and I wanted to keep us kind of focused on the housing. But one of the things that did strike me about when you were talking was this idea of this, I suppose, in a way, the ordinariness of what they were trying to achieve. This was not a spectacular vision. It was a dignified and everyday new urban reality for people. And then there's this other side, which is that a lot of this is built around the motor car. So this idea of an emancipatory technology that goes alongside it, which is, I think, another fascinating aspect of it. But I think for a lot of people, when we think of, again, and I speak principally from my own background and the prejudices that I grew up, I suppose, thinking about when we talked about council housing, again, in the period of Margaret Thatcher, was that they were kind of boring and kind of ordinary and a bit often enough ugly. And in your book you document, and in your blog you document, examples of early 20th century housing, which is very neo-vernacular, very kind of, again, very ordinary, bit pastoral perhaps. Also all the way through council housing has been characterized outside of those remarkable examples like Ernest Goldfinger and the Smithsons and so on, characterized by a very kind of normative aesthetic. Is that right? Am I right in reading that? Or was there an attempt, much as there was through the planning to produce a new citizenry, to produce a new kind of, through the aesthetics and forms of the architecture, to produce a new kind of consciousness about the possibilities of design, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I think broadly speaking, your perspective is probably correct. So, yeah, I suppose if you kind of again track the history, as you say, in the earliest years, the 1890s, pre-war period, particularly pre-First World War, you have this arts and crafts tradition, liberal housing reformers were definitely promoting the cottage aesthetic. But by the time you get to the First World War, you get to the Tudor Walters report, which really kind of was the template of interwar design. You're moving to this neo-Georgian. It's a plainer, standardized design, of the cheaper to build, but much far more feasible to build at scale with that kind of simplified form. And yes, certainly into the 1930s, there was very little influence of sort of what you might call kind of continental modernism. Councillors and sort of borough architects did go on this kind of grand tour. So they did go to Vienna, visited Paris and Hamburg and Berlin. But really, the kind of direct impact of that modernist ideology and design was very limited. You could literally pick out 3 or 4 estates maybe before 1945. I think in the post-war period, I think it's slightly more interesting, and I want to both agree and disagree with you, which is kind of slightly complicated. I think overwhelmingly, I think you're absolutely right. If you think about the statistics, which are not kind of where people imagine council housing as a sort of stereotype, 2/3 of council homes built from 1945 to 1979 were just very conventional 2-story family homes, semi-detached terraced homes, whatever. Now, amongst that, of course, there was a commitment to far better design and genuinely attractive sort of quasi-modernist design, but most of it was very ordinary, happily ordinary, I would say, and obviously much better. At least people believed it then, much better than the kind of slum housing that from which people were moving. So yes, absolutely, I think most council housing was ordinary, and I think that's sort of something actually in the sense that I want to honour rather than condemn. But of course, you do get other powerful currents at the time, particularly amongst the larger and more ambitious authorities, back to the London County Council. And one of my favourite sort of statistics or kind of quantitative sort of appraisals of post-war council housing. LCC Architects Department was the largest architectural practice in the world. It employed 1,500 staff. It had 350 professional architects and trainees. 250 of those worked in the housing division. So the LCC was absolutely, really in the vanguard of architectural practice, I would say, in the post-war period. And if you look at the 1950s in particular, when that department was at its zenith, you do see quite fierce architectural battles being fought between kind of the different ideologies, as it were, of form and function. So you have on the one hand definitely what were called the hard architects, the brutalists, committed to sort of a monumental style, referencing Le Corbusier. But actually, probably more numerically, quantitatively more influential were the so-called soft architects, the new humanists who looked towards Scandinavia and a more picturesque, kind of slightly more vernacular form of architecture.
Can you name some estates that embody this?
Well, I'll name one estate, which is the most wonderful example of this, and probably hopefully some of your listeners might be familiar with it already, but it's the Alton estate, which is over in Roehampton, West London, on the fringes of West London. And actually, so Alton East was designed by the the softies, those who look to Scandinavia for their inspiration. So it has a more picturesque feel, I guess. Whereas if you go to Alton West, which was begun towards slightly later, so early 50s, later 50s, Alton West has these grand slab blocks sort of bestriding the hill in spectacular fashion. So Alton East, Alton West actually absolutely perfectly kind of summarizes that conflict. And of course, beyond that there are those sort of what we might call star architects who are working in private practice, but nevertheless were commissioned by local authorities. And obviously, as you mentioned, Goldfinger with Balfron Tower, Trelake Tower, Bucharest, I guess you would call that. Dennis Lasdon bringing a very distinct aesthetic to Bethnal Green, which is where he worked for the local council. Bertold Lebetkin, who built a number of major schemes, particularly for Finsbury Borough Council at the time. So you have those people. And of course, you have quite significant, in due course, quite significant borough architects departments where you do have both quite powerful borough architects or city architects heading that organisation and employing, of course, very ambitious and well qualified staff. It's also worth remembering at this time that, well, into the 1970s, 49% of qualified architects worked in the public sector. So, most architects and not only worked in the public sector, or at least, half of them did, but actually many of them chose to. That they felt that their capacity, their idealism could be far better expressed in the public service, in the public sector, than it could be working privately. And so I'll bring this to a close. But if you're looking at the later 60s, of course, you have really, again, in London, you have Camden and Lambeth, renowned as bastions of modernist progressive design, housing design. I'd reference Aberdeen, where you had a very powerful borough architect. As a Norfolk boy, I'm gonna shout out for Norwich City Council, David Percival, who built an enormous range of high quality housing in Norwich from the mid 50s through to 1974. So beyond what I would call the happily ordinary, the kind of template designs, sort of very kind of sort of banal housing, if you will, you definitely have architects working for or within the public sector, committed to high standards and innovative design, I would say.
Everything obviously changes with the election of the Conservative government in 1979 and this rise of the marketization of housing and the decline in the production of council housing. And I would love you to hear your reflections on the effects that's had on the council housing that continued to be built. What was the effect of this kind of distrust that this caused amongst the general population about this urban form, this architectural typology of the council house? I guess I'm thinking about this not just at the level of the building itself, but also the urbanism that it sits within.
Yeah, well, yes, of course. So 79 offers a very convenient sort of watershed, and quite reasonably and rightly so. But again, I would, you have to kind of read that story backwards as I would argue. Thatcher doesn't emerge from sort of clear blue water, as it were. There are antecedents and precedents for what's happening. So we were talking about architecture, and design, and of course one of the elements that reflected the ambition to build, to eradicate the slums, build on an enormous scale in the mid to later 60s, was the use of system building. So that's off the peg forms of sort of basically factory production, various forms of system-built prefabricated production, and a lot of those typically multi-story blocks many of them were defective, and a lot of them seemed to many people to be kind of very offensive in terms of their appearance, and sort of offensive or sort of overpowering in terms of their appearance. So there is this shift there is this sort of high profile, very visible shift to which there is a strong reaction, and by the later 60s even, towards high rise and system building. And of course, the part of that kind of changed opinion of council housing really dates from the mid 70s, or emerges from the mid 70s. Into the 60s, I would argue absolutely that council housing was seen as aspirational housing. It was always a step up to something better, and of course it was celebrated by the media, as bringing this new Britain that we talked about in the post-war context. So Thatcher, in a sense, is inheriting that sort of pre-existing emerging antagonism to the form of council housing and the scale of council housing by the 1970s. But Thatcher, of course, an idealist. She's an ideologue, and she's an idealist. She genuinely believed, I think I'll give her credit for this, that the free market would be more effective and more efficient in delivering housing and meeting the range of housing needs. And she, so you talk about what happened to council housing in the 1980s. Well, of course, fundamentally, it stops. In terms of new build, it virtually stops. We were building between 45 and 79. We built on average 126,000 new council homes annually. 2020 to by 2023, 24, we built 10,000, 9,800 to be exact. So that's the sort of enormous shift that's taken place in the production of council homes. Meanwhile, of course, right to buy, allowing sitting tenants to buy their council homes, had an enormous impact. We've sold about 2.5 million council homes have been lost to right to buy. Initially, of course, bought by sitting tenants, but almost 40% of those now in the private sector, private rental sector. And the other thing, you talk about your impressions of council housing in the 1980s, is that it's, I'm going to use the jargon here and try and unpack what that means, is that it became residualized. So whereas certainly into the 1960s, as I kind of said already, it was a step up. It was seen as good housing for a respectable working class, a sign of rising living standards and social mobility. By the 1980s, because of the decline in housing stock, because of the legislative priority given to those in housing need, it becomes residualized. It becomes increasingly housing of last resort for the poorest of the community. So council housing, yes, there's a huge kind of psychic shift, if you will, as to how people, not necessarily the people that lived in it, but certainly in terms of how it's portrayed and understood by observers in the media, and maybe by a sort of swathe of public opinion, unfamiliar with the realities. It's absolutely seen as sort of poor housing for poor people, essentially.
And I guess this perception starts inflecting local authority priorities in terms of maintenance, and it becomes, to all intents and purposes, a vicious cycle.
Well, yeah, local authorities don't have much say in all this, of course, because we're a very centralised system, and as I said right at the start, basically local authorities can only do what they're allowed to do by central government. Mrs. Thatcher was the Conservative governments of the 1980s were quite ruthless in terms of not only halting new build, in promoting right to buy, and incidentally, of course, the income generated by right to buy that money went to the Treasury. It didn't go to local authorities. They weren't allowed to rebuild council housing, or build new council housing. And in terms of the overall housing budget, it was slashed in the 1980s. So, with whether willingly or not, local authorities really had far more limited power to maintain housing in good council housing in good condition, let alone almost no power whatsoever to build new council homes.
We're running out of time, and I did want to sort of touch on the replacement form of social housing provision through housing associations, community-based housing associations, that sort of thing. But perhaps we don't have space for it now. And of course, you start your book mentioning Grenfell, and Grenfell is a topic different to this one, perhaps, and perhaps too big and too traumatic in many ways for this subject, which is really a story of hope. The idea of council housing in that moment, that emergent collective psychology of the 20th century in Britain of hope, and then manifest in bricks and mortar and concrete, in the case of Balfron, which is it's a beautiful story to tell. I suppose, however, you can't get away from the context of the disestablishment of social housing or council housing through the 1980s and 90s. We can't get away from the rise of social housing provision and this new form of quasi-commercial, quasi-state organizations in the form of these very large housing associations. I suppose the question I want to ask off the back of all of that verbiage is, what does the history of council housing perhaps indicate in terms of where we might be going next, particularly in light of our current government's objectives of building huge amounts of housing again?
Yeah. Well, I, as an historian, I like the quote from another historian who said that the future is not my period. So it's obviously pretty hard to predict. I mean, we do have as you said, we do have a government, a Labour government, committed to building far more housing. Some of that significant element of that is supposed to be affordable housing. I won't get into the debate here about what affordable means as opposed to what social rent housing means, but there is a difference and it's important. I think the government is clearly ambitious in terms of using reforming planning laws to extending powers of compulsory purchase, and in that sense, at least enabling both housing associations and local authorities and private developers to build at greater scale. I think those will have a positive but limited effect. And I suppose in conclusion, I'm going to just go back to the future, because for me, and of course others will disagree, but for me, what we learn from British history, we learn from that sort of long 20th century, is actually when we built housing at scale for those in need, most effectively, most efficiently, most cost effectively, we did so using the power and finance of the state, not in grossly subsidized form. These were, we used public investment to support local authority construction. This was money overwhelmingly recouped through rents over 40, 60 years, money that was paid back to the Public Works Loans Board, which lent the money from central government, from the Treasury, as it were. So this was a very effective model. The numbers speak for themselves, and overwhelmingly, with exceptions, it built good quality, attractive housing for many millions of people.
But if you were to pick a typology that did what one would hope council housing would do, slab blocks, tower blocks, semi-Ds, what would you say would be the architectural goal of this kind of rebuilding? Like, if we're going to be building lots and lots of housing, and it looks to me that the approach taken to housing is to build large quantities of sort of not even McMansions. It's like McMansions minus rather grim little places. That can't be the solution. Does the history of council housing indicate a model that was most effective at achieving these socially integrated, emancipatory aims?
Wow. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose my sort of brief and glib response would be let 100 flowers bloom. And I think with when you had that sort of a quasi-devolved system of housing construction, when you had local authorities that could build, they could employ their own architects and designers, they could apply their own political priorities, I guess, but also reflect local conditions. You did get a range of designs, a range of forms, appropriate more or less to local circumstance. And I talked to a lot of architecture students, and I think you weren't quite going there, but I always kind of resist sort of architectural determinism, because I think, the most important thing about any home is that it's affordable, decent, and secure. And I think that can exist in a range of forms. It can be a slab block, a tower block, it can be a semi-detached terraced home, whatever, And I think that's a really important thing to say, and it's a cliche. But through that sort of 12 years of research or whatever it is now on local estates and local schemes and so on, the number of times you see, well, my home, my flat, my new house was like Buckingham Palace, and it's not a form of housing. It's about opening that front door and feeling safe and secure, and with good facilities. So I think that would be my model, in a sense. It would be to allow, to enable and empower and to give financial possibility to local authorities, housing associations, to build progressively, to build innovatively, to build in a range of forms to meet local needs and priorities. And I think that's what a progressive state, that's what a state should do. It's about enabling rather than prescribing. Practically, I think developing, depending on private developers, doing it on the cheap, will definitely does lead, as I think you're implying, to sort of pretty bland and very kind of generic housing, which I think is a shame, because I think in terms of what we've seen of sort of the worst of low-cost private development, I won't libel any private developers here. But yeah, it's of a very low standard, both in terms of environment and design, and we can do better than that. We should do better than that. So I hope that amidst all this progressive talk and the possibility of building at scale, that as I said, that we will allow and enable people to build well, to build in a range of forms. And always remembering, because I think this is the crucial thing, that when you spend on housing, you're investing in people's lives, you're investing in community, you're investing in well-being. And even with initial upfront costs, what you spend, you can recoup many times in terms of social benefit, personal security and progress, and so on. So that's my kind of my manifesto, as it were.
Fantastic. That's a brilliant point to finish, John. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you. Nice to talk. Thank you.
As Flowrider put it, open up the champagne, pop, it's my house. Come on, turn it up. Hear a knock on the door and the night begins, because we've done this before, so you can come on in. Make yourself at my home. Tell me where you've been. Pour yourself something cold, maybe. Cheers to this. I think this perfectly sums up the sentiment of Municipal Dream. Thank you to John for taking the time to speak with me, and for all his wonderful work over the years, documenting this important thing. Please see the podcast description for links to the blog and to the book too on the REBA website. And thanks for listening.